Now, once you've done those studies, maybe a few times, experimented, it's time for your first subject. And this is a willing subject. This is an egg. The egg won't fight you. You want to put the egg down somewhere where it won't move, roll away. Say right here. Ideally, and again, this isn't really ideal, but ideally I have light coming from all directions, which is much less than ideal. You'd like to have light coming mostly from one direction so that you have distinct light and shadow to kind of replicate what you did in the value studies. And again, you did 3 of them, but essentially all the same thing from white to dark. We're going to do the same thing and apply it to this object. Of course, that's very different in the application. The really important thing is that you have as much of a reference as possible in terms of what you're looking at, the object that you're looking at. This isn't too good here, but I'm going to exaggerate. And we're going to do this a couple of different ways. First, this is my lightest. So I'm going to do a wet on dry technique, and I'm going to do a wet on wet technique. First, the wet on dry. That's kind of the easiest to demonstrate. I'm going to start with that. And I'm not going to draw this first. It's an egg. But certainly, I mean, if you feel more comfortable, and if you're a non-major and you haven't had a lot of drawing experience, don't worry about it. It's kind of oval, round, just get the idea. What we're looking at is the gradation on the object. It makes this thing look round. So the gradation is important in revealing the form. The shape, which is the outline, that's a different thing. And your shape doesn't have to be perfect. We're looking at the form, the gradation. So, when you do wet on dry, you're going to start with your lightest tone. And basically, we are going to work around the lightest tone. It's a good idea always to have some white areas of the paper. In other words, even though essentially I don't really maybe have anything that's pure white on that egg, I'm going to leave this area pure white. And I'm going to paint with my lightest light. Again, keep plenty of water on your brush. It should be easy to move the paint, shouldn't be laborious, shouldn't have a whole lot of brush strokes. Okay? Now, if I'm doing wet on dry, I'm going to have to wait a little bit and let that dry. Okay? So in the meantime, let's start our wet on wet version too. And I want you to do both. Try both techniques. Now again, size. Don't make it real hard on yourself by painting too small or too large. I'm going to start off, and basically everything that you're doing in the beginning is just an experiment. Now we're going to do a little bit of something called pulling. Pulling is when you squeeze all the paint, all the water out of your brush, just dip it into clean water. Put a little bit of clean water down and go right up to that edge. If you go right up to that edge, you can pull out a little bit of that paint. Now, we'll get more into these techniques, but the idea is creating a soft edge there. It's wet on wet, but you're actually, once you've put in paint down, and I'm going to pick up this paint here too, so that's another thing you can do. Once we've got paint down, you can go around any edge you want with a wet brush and soften that edge, just like this. I'm going to do this, say, on the back side of the egg, where the edge might be a little bit softer. You can see the blue and the sepia separate a little. Pigments will do that. It's not something you're doing wrong. Pigments just do that, especially sometimes when you introduce water or you have a lot of water in the mixture. Okay, so this is a little softer now, this edge, working wet on wet. I'm going to go now to something a little bit darker. Okay, and I'm going to lay down a little bit more paint in certain areas. You might, as you're going, you might want to switch the size of your brush too. Just don't work too small. Don't work with too small of a brush. So this value essentially is kind of like a light middle value. We're basically doing the same thing that you're doing on your simple value scale. The difference is you're doing it in a different shape. Instead of doing a long rectangle, you're doing it in more of an ellipse. And, you know, that happens to be what a egg is. Now, if we wanted to, this might be a good time to introduce a shadow. If you want an object to look like it's sitting on a surface, not floating in the air, you need to break that bottom edge. Do a little bit of a shadow, and I'm going to do a little bit of a shadow here. Just breaking that bottom edge, doing a little bit of a shadow. I'm going to make it a little bit warmer, a little bit lighter, but it helps to make that object look like it's sitting, not floating in the air. And we'll definitely deal with that issue a lot more as we go along. So you can see the wet on wet, how the paint tends to spread itself out. And that's the thing about watercolor. If you've ever done any oil painting or acrylic painting, you have to push the paint everywhere. In watercolor, your vehicle is water, the pigment suspended in the water. When you paint wet on wet to a great extent, the paint does the work for you. And the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that you could be preventing that by overworking, by doing too much. In other words, if you're doing too much of this, and a lot of times people are doing that when they're being really careful, too many brush strokes, too little paint, you know, and so they'll do a little really light shadow, right? Took me a couple of seconds, and you know, they'll spend that long on it. So that's what you want to try and not do. Again, the shadow where the bottom of the egg and a surface would meet, this would get darker, but I'm not going to get into that too much right now. I'm going to go one step darker while this is still wet, and we're going to go a little bit darker in here. We might get a little bit of glare, but we want to try and work around what glare we have. I'm going to go up the shadow, pay attention to where your shadow tends to be the darkest. Try when you're doing wet on wet, try and let the paint spread out on its own. Now if we go back to this, you can see, you know, how the paint distributes. There's a little bit of variation in it, if you can see that. As I said, the blue and the sepia will separate a little bit. But let's go back into this and see how we do with the next value. And I'm going to let that go. So I'm going to go back into here with a darker gray. Wet on dry does give you a little bit more control, but it's also tricky. It gives you a lot of hard edges. Now I've got a mid-tone, light tone, but I've got hard edges, fairly hard edges, in the middle of a gradation. In other words, it's not going to be as smooth a gradation as we would have here when you're doing wet on wet. Now again, one thing you can do to kind of facilitate maybe you know, not quite as many edges. And again, you got to be careful because you can get into overworking things really quickly. But you just squeeze out all the paint, you know, after you've washed it. Squeeze out all the paint and water. Just get a little bit of clean water on your brush. Little bit. And try just going over those edges and see if you can soften them up. You gotta have a light touch, and you can't overdo it. If you overdo it, and this is basically another version of what we call pulling. Taking a wet brush, pulling pigment a little and getting a softer edge. Okay, so here basically things kind of take care of themselves. You know, you still might want to go back into any wet on wet painting, and you can do wet on dry. It isn't one or the other. You know, wet on dry has certain advantages, like we said, control, and to a great extent, it's much easier to overwork wet on dry also. So that's a disadvantage. Wet on wet does a lot of the work for you. It may not be your inclination, but you need to try that and see how it goes. And again, you're not going to decide in the first week or 2 weeks how you're going to work going forward. You're going to keep experimenting. Now I'm going to go a little bit darker, and this is starting to dry out a little, but we can go a little bit further with it. Drop in a few more darks. That's pretty dark. And again, you can see the basic shape there. If we wanted to work on that bottom edge, we could put a little bit more dark on both sides of that bottom edge. Now my eggs are a little too round, I think. They could have been more oval. But that could be the chicken that they came from. So again, all these things are interchangeable. Wet on dry technique, wet on wet technique, a combination of the two. So now I've taken both of these renderings to a certain point. This being wet on dry having a little bit more control, this being wet on wet. They're pretty similar. Again, there's advantages to both. One of the things wet on dry allows you to do is maybe come back the next day. This is completely dry. And again, with a subject like an egg, it's very high key, which means overall very light in value. You may not get to your darkest darks. But working wet on dry allows you to go back maybe another day, go back in, put a little bit more detail in, you know, maybe just a slightly darker dark in a certain spot. It's hard to do that with wet on wet. You can try. You can always re-wet an area and try and lay some paint on. But what's usually going to happen is whatever paint you put down, you know, to a certain extent it'll have the same look, it'll blend in, but it may go to those edges of wherever it's wet and kind of freeze at those edges, and then you have edges maybe where you don't want them. So generally speaking, again, there's advantages and disadvantages to each. Try both. And what you end up doing might be a combination of the two.